Today we have two guest speakers. Our first guest speaker is Temple Hiatt. She is a long-term gun violence prevention advocate and activist, a veteran of the first Gulf War and member of the Iowa City community for over 40 years. Temple's personal experience of gun suicide by a member of her family informs her understanding of the sensible steps that can take to prevent gun violence. So I'm really happy to have Temple with us today. And after Temple is done sharing, we will move to Ruthina Malone. Ruthina is the department administrator for psychological and brain sciences at the University of Iowa College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. She has worked for the university in various positions since 2003. She's also the vice president of the school board of the Iowa City Community School District and is currently a member of Kirkwood Community College's Foundation board of directors. So thank you both for taking time out of your busy schedules to be a part of this important conversation discussion through the Senior Center and with with Liz O'Hare and Lenore's help in pulling all this together. So
Thank you, Michelle, and to the Senior Center for supporting this topic. And of course, to Lynn and Lenore for coordinating the many sessions. I joined, as Michelle mentioned, I joined the Army Reserve's military police with the intent of becoming a police officer. And I served in Saudi Arabia during the first Gulf War. I've been trained to use many weapons of war, and I share this with you because I want you to know that my military training is what informs my understanding of gun safety. Like some veterans, I've owned a gun, and owning a gun is a very personal decision, and it's our constitutional right. When I gave birth to my son, owning that gun gave me serious pause. I knew I wasn't going to keep up with my training, and I didn't want the presence of a gun to be a temptation for him or any of his friends. So I sold my gun to Shields, and I've never second guessed that decision, ever. I became involved with Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America and the gun safety movement because I wanted to reclaim the voice of a veteran who understands gun safety and what that means in today's world. In learning about their efforts, I discovered I was a gun violence survivor. I cared for my nephew when he was growing up, and he lived with me while attending classes at the university. And he died by gun suicide at the age of 33. That day, he had reached out to his mother, my sister, to ask about a history of mental illness in our family. And then he was simply gone, and we were left with so many questions that will never be answered. So these are the things that motivate me to stay in this work. Gun violence prevention is a multifaceted effort. There are a lot of things we can do right here in our community, and I will touch on some of those today. And the first thing I'd like to highlight is the upcoming proposed gun amendment that's going to be on the ballot in November. So as I mentioned, in November of 2022, Iowans will vote on a proposed amendment to the Iowa Constitution for the first time since 2010. Supporters call this amendment the Right to Firearms Amendment and describe it as the addition of the Second Amendment to Iowa's Constitution. And in this presentation, you'll learn why this description is misleading. Many public safety interest groups are recommending that the public vote no. These interest groups represent public health, gun violence prevention, domestic violence intervention, and religious groups. If you have questions as we go along here, please drop them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. The content you're going to hear today has been created by volunteers in the gun violence prevention movement. While we did get some input from those in the legal profession, we are not lawyers. So if you have questions about the gun violence statistics and methodology, please visit everystat.org. Today, we'll take a look at gun violence in Iowa, along with the legislative changes over the last 5 years that have weakened Iowa's gun safety laws. Then we'll review the ballot measure language and its potential impact based on what we've seen happen in the 3 other states that currently have a similar version of this amendment. And at the end, I hope you have a deeper understanding of why this proposed amendment is not simply the Second Amendment, but a much more extreme version. I'd like to highlight a couple of gun violence demographics here in Iowa. In 2020, guns were the second leading cause of death among children and teens in Iowa. Only motor vehicles caused more deaths. And nationwide, firearms are now the leading cause of death for children and teens. Black people are disproportionately impacted by gun violence here in Iowa and are 16 times more likely than white people to die by gun homicide. Black children and teens are 6 times more likely than their white peers to die by guns. Overall, gun violence costs Iowa $2 billion each year. This cost includes state medical care, first responders, ambulances, police, and criminal justice services related to gun violence. The good news is Iowa has the 42nd highest rate of gun deaths in the US. The bad news is this rate was lower and it continues to climb. Last year, we were ranked 43rd. The chart on the right is a graph of Iowa's rate of gun deaths per 100,000 people. And from 2011 to 2020, Iowa's rate of gun deaths increased 56%. However, nationwide, this increase was only 33%. During the same time period, Iowa's rate for gun suicide nearly tripled the national rate. And our rate for gun homicide more than doubled the national rate. Again, further statistics and references and methodology on this data can be found at everystat.org. The bottom line is that Iowa is trending at an alarmingly higher rate than the national average. Many believe this is due in large part to the weakening of Iowa's gun safety laws. In 2017, Iowa passed a stand your ground law, which removed the duty to retreat before using force in self-defense. Stand your ground laws allow people to shoot to kill in public, even when they can safely walk away from the danger. In 2020, Iowa passed a preemptive law that effectively forced the removal of local gun safety laws. Here locally, firearms are now permitted in municipal and county-owned spaces. A child visiting the library could open an adult's purse, simply looking for a piece of gum, and instead find a loaded handgun. This preemptive law also prevents cities and counties from passing future gun safety laws, like the law recently passed in San Jose, California, that requires gun owners to purchase liability insurance. And due to the removal of Iowa's permitting laws in 2021, a firearm can be purchased without a background check and carried in public without demonstrating any proficiency or that they've even fired the gun. This is not an all-encompassing presentation, and unfortunately, there are many, many factors in Iowa that contribute to gun violence. However, the passage of these laws didn't reduce gun violence. They've simply allowed more guns in public spaces. And the passage of these laws is not unique to Iowa. In fact, it's part of a larger trend across the nation. For example, as of January, 20 states already have permitless carry laws, and 12 more are actively pushing to allow people to carry concealed handguns without a permit, training, or background check. Responsible gun owners, law enforcement, and the majority of Americans all oppose permitless carry. You can learn more about this dangerous trend at everytownresearch.org. This may look familiar. It's the language for the United States Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In order to place a proposed amendment to the Iowa Constitution on the ballot, it must pass 2 consecutive General Assemblies. Let's take a closer look at the actual language that was passed. The ballot will read, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The sovereign state of Iowa affirms and recognizes this right to be a fundamental individual right. Any and all restrictions of this right shall be subject to strict scrutiny." This phrase is not the Second Amendment. The addition of these words, "any and all restrictions of this right shall be subject to strict scrutiny," is not in the US Constitution. And strict scrutiny is what makes this proposed amendment very different and very extreme. So what is strict scrutiny and how will it potentially change things? Very simply, strict scrutiny is a legal test. It is the highest level of scrutiny a court can use to decide whether a law is unconstitutional. And under this amendment, judges would be forced to use an unusually stringent standard of review when considering legal challenges to any restrictive gun law. My understanding is you've already heard from University of Iowa law professor Todd Pettis, and he has said that strict scrutiny is a common constitutional standard of review to determine if individual rights are being violated. So when a court applies strict scrutiny, the courts are demanding a compelling justification for interfering with those individual rights. Iowa Senator Julian Garrett believes, despite current federal law, some judges have ruled, in his view, against that right. He said the proposed amendment protects that right even further because we've learned over the years that not all judges respect the intent of the people that wrote the Second Amendment. Only a few states have adopted this extreme approach. Louisiana passed their amendment in 2012. Alabama and Missouri followed in 2014. This extreme approach would invite frivolous litigation, undermine decades of case law in the state courts, and put in jeopardy many moderate common sense gun laws. Here's an example. Iowa currently does not allow felons to possess firearms, nor do these 3 states. Louisiana, Alabama, and Missouri all had their felon in possession laws challenged by defendants multiple times in courts. Further, Missouri taxpayers spent millions defending their existing laws against felons seeking protection under this extreme version of the Second Amendment. Polls show that the majority of Iowa voters, including gun owners, are in favor of Iowa's sensible restrictions on the purchase and use of firearms. Iowa's current laws keep felons from having firearms, keep perpetrators of domestic violence from having firearms, keep guns out of schools, keep restrictions on machine guns and other offensive weapons. These are the types of laws, if challenged under this extreme version of the Second Amendment, might be declared unconstitutional. Iowa Representative Stephen Holt sponsored the resolution, and moments before the legislation passed the House, ended his closing statement. "Thank you to the United States Marine Corps and John Wayne for teaching me that for law-abiding citizens, the most effective gun control is a firm grip and a steady hand." Again, under this proposed amendment, judges would be forced to use an unusually narrow standard of review when considering legal challenges to any gun safety law. This narrow approach could then be used by our legislature when considering future gun laws. Here are a few to consider. Iowa does not have a secure storage law. Many states have laws that require firearms to be stored locked, unloaded, and separate from ammunition. Massachusetts has one, and they are ranked 51st with one of the lowest rates of gun deaths in the US. Iowa does not have a red flag law. Red flag laws allow loved ones or law enforcement to intervene by petitioning a court for an order to temporarily prevent someone in crisis from accessing guns. These laws are effective because when a person is in crisis and considering harming themselves or others, family members and law enforcement are often the first people to see the warning signs. Iowa no longer requires permitting. However, nearly 70% of Iowans, including gun owners, supported Iowa's permitting law. If we're ever in a position to reinstate a permitting law or consider other gun safety laws, it's possible they would be declared unconstitutional under this amendment. And that's the point. The point of this is to restrict future gun control bills. This is from Iowa State Senator Jason Schultz, who supports the ballot measure. We mentioned earlier that Iowa ranks 42nd for rate of gun deaths in the United States. This is what gun violence looks like in the 3 states with a similar amendment. According to everystat.org, Missouri has the 5th highest rate of gun deaths in the US, Louisiana has the 3rd highest rate, and Alabama has the 4th highest rate. This includes all gun deaths: homicide, suicide, unintentional shootings, police shootings, along with undetermined gun deaths. In a recent CNN article reported on a study that found that there is a direct correlation in states with weaker gun laws and higher rates of gun deaths. Iowa Senator Kevin Kinney is a 28-year veteran of law enforcement and spoke against this proposed amendment. Not many of you have ever had to sit and look down the barrel of a gun. I have on a number of occasions. When you are placing strict scrutiny into the Constitution, you're going to be diminishing our laws that are on the books. And to me, this is going to make law enforcement more dangerous. Let's look at the other groups that lobbied against the passage of this proposed amendment. As I mentioned in the beginning, voting no on this extreme version of the Second Amendment aligns you with this broad group that lobbied against the proposed ballot measure. These groups represent gun safety, gun violence prevention, public safety, public health, women's health and safety, religious faiths, and the League of Women Voters of Iowa. Leslie Carpenter is the founder of Iowa Mental Health Advocacy and lobbied against the proposed ballot measure. She has an adult son with a schizoaffective disorder and has been very open about her family's challenges with access to mental health services here in Iowa. She works to educate legislators and law enforcement about implementing successful programs operating in other parts of the country. And Leslie states extreme risk protection orders, also known as red flag laws, have proven to reduce suicides in other states, as temporary removal of guns is the #1 way to prevent suicide by gun. As a serious brain disorders advocate, my first concern with the proposed ballot measure is that it would prevent life-saving gun legislation like this in Iowa. Connie Ryan is the executive director of the Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, another organization that lobbied against the proposed amendment. It goes far beyond what the Second Amendment does. It really would do great potential damage to the laws that have been in the state that responsible gun owners want to have to keep that balance of rights and public health and safety. The proposed amendment on the ballot is not the Second Amendment. The language, any and all restrictions shall be subject to strict scrutiny. makes this an extreme approach that will invite frivolous litigation and will most certainly put in jeopardy Iowa's current and future gun safety laws. And under this proposed amendment, judges would be forced to use an unusually stringent standard of review when considering legal challenges to any restrictive gun law. This proposed amendment won't make Iowa safer. Representative Beth Wessel-Kroschel said the amendment would likely take down every reasonable gun law in Iowa if it raises the standard beyond the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The current language in the U.S. Constitution regarding the Second Amendment already protects the right to bear arms, and the strict scrutiny language is unnecessary. Every American should have the freedom to be safe in our homes, neighborhoods, and communities. Freedom to live our lives without the constant threat of gun violence hanging over our heads. So we're asking everyone, when you hear news outlets reporting the ballot measure as just the Second Amendment, please correct them. Strict scrutiny isn't in the U.S. Constitution, and it goes beyond the Second Amendment. Make sure they are reporting on the impact this extreme approach will have on current and future gun safety laws. And we're more than happy to share this information with others and present this again and again to anyone that's interested. Ballot measures are very difficult to defeat, and as we've seen today, the language is oftentimes misleading. Many voters don't turn the ballot over or simply refrain from voting for fear of voting the wrong way. And with supporters calling this effort the Freedom Amendment and promoting it as just the Second Amendment, we have our work cut out for us. So at the very least, we're asking that you vote no on November 8th. If you want to do more, invite others to attend future presentations. Again, hold the media accountable. Remember, this is not the Second Amendment. Write a letter to the editor, host a presentation with your club or volunteer group, and ask related organizations to approve a statement or pass a resolution opposing this ballot measure. And of course, if you're on Twitter, go ahead and tweet out using the #IALegis hashtag. Many of the groups that lobbied against this amendment that we talked about earlier, along with their supporters, have formed a PAC called Iowans for Responsible Gun Laws. They believe this amendment puts the right to carry a gun above the right to safety. And we must defeat the reckless gun amendment that would prohibit responsible gun laws in Iowa. Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America is a nonprofit, nonpartisan grassroots movement of Americans fighting for public safety measures that can protect people from gun violence. There are several communities in Iowa that have active groups, Johnson County being one of them. So here's some information on how to get involved with Moms Demand Action. So thank you again for listening to this content. This is my email address. If you have any comments or questions or would like to set up a future presentation, you can certainly email me. I will stop sharing right now and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
When writing a letter to the editor, how should we refer to the amendment?
So that's a really good question. It's simply a ballot measure that's going to be on it. I know in some states they have multiple ballot measures. So, probably one of the most famous ones was California's Prop 8. But I think this is going to be the only one listed on the ballot. So it's simply going to say ballot measure 1. So you can call it Iowa's gun amendment. You can call it the reckless gun amendment, which is what the Iowans for gun safety laws is calling it. There really is no perfect term or phrase.
Are there any funds available to do some advertising before the election?
I think I think that's something that that other group, the Iowans for Responsible Gun Laws, is working towards. That's why they have formed a political action committee to raise funds to do that. And I believe they did have a large op-ed in the Des Moines Register just this past Sunday. In addition to the groups that I've mentioned, like I said, we partner with the neighborhood groups like South District Neighborhood Association, who invest time and energy into revitalization efforts. I'm a proud resident of the South District. I grew up here. I moved back here, and I love my community. We also partner with groups who interrupt gun violence. These are people in communities who reach out to those individuals actually causing the gun violence and try to get them to stop through community resources and conflict resolution efforts. In other parts of the country, these groups are called SNUG, which is simply guns spelled backwards. And Cure Violence is another worldwide effort. And they now have a presence in Des Moines. We don't have anything specifically here in the Johnson County community, but I know that Johnson County and the city of Iowa City has received American Rescue Plan Act funds, and they are actively partnering with other counties and cities to address gun violence in our community. So they are listening to many of those that I've mentioned here today who are directly involved with prevention efforts. So individually, we can all have conversations about access to guns. Most people who attempt suicide don't die unless they use a gun. And 68% of the veterans who die by suicide use a gun. So we must discuss access to guns, especially when it comes to those who might be at risk of harming themselves or others. And as adults, it's always our responsibility to keep our children safe. We have a program that empowers parents and caregivers to have this conversation. And Ruthina Malone has been instrumental in helping us get this message to the school district. And I want to allow her to share this message and why it is so important for our community.
Hi, everybody. And thanks again to Temple and Michelle for the introduction. As Michelle mentioned, I am on the Iowa City Community School District School Board. I'm also a member of the Johnson County Black Voices Project and the Johnson County Moms Demand Action Group. They all take part in gun intervention education for our community in hopes of educating folks about safe gun storage and usage, but also trying to do our best to protect the children of the community. I joined all these groups because I wanted to make systematic changes, especially around gun violence intervention, that, as you heard from Temple, not only affect Black Americans 4 to 16 times more than other races, depending on the research, but also dramatically affect the lives of all children in their most formative years that can lead to lasting effects that we can see in their educational and personal life journeys, and can oftentimes lead to entry into the criminal justice system. As a mom, I was always concerned about my child's safety when she visited friends' homes because she had severe food and environmental allergies. So I would oftentimes go over a list of questions to ensure that she wouldn't be exposed to those things that could put her at a high medical risk when she was out of my supervision. My list of questions changed after April 16th, 2007. If you all don't remember, on this day, a gunman killed 32 students and faculty at Virginia Tech. And I realized that as a parent, I need to make sure that my child could be protected or would be protected from gun violence, not only in my home, but also when she's visiting other people's homes. So I began to ask families if guns were present in the home, and if they were stored securely in a location where the children couldn't access it, and if they were being stored separately from the ammunition, as well as being safe from the children getting the ammunition. And depending on the answers to these questions, I would either allow my child to visit that home, or I would sometimes have to offer to host the play date in ours. Never was that conversation questioning anyone's ability to exercise their Second Amendment right. It was just to ensure that we were taken into consideration as adults. We were doing our part to make sure that children were protected. This conversation, as you can imagine, wasn't always easy to have, but parents always understood why it was necessary. And some even started to ask other new friends that their child may have those same questions, the parents those same questions, because oftentimes we never really thought about that until you're asked that question. And then you think, oh, that might be a good question to know when I'm sending my child to someone's home. Now, as a school board member, I can say thanks to Temple and the Johnson County Moms Demand Action Group. As a board, we've made this hopefully an easier conversation to have for other families with the passage of the Be Smart resolution. And Temple is sharing that right now. The Be Smart campaign was launched by Every Town for Gun Safety and shared with the ICCSD School District and Board by Moms Demand Action to raise awareness that secure gun storage, again, meaning storing guns locked and unloaded and separate from ammunition, and how this can save children's lives, not only in the home, but sadly at schools, as we hear more and more about school shootings occurring by school-aged children. This resolution directs the school district administration to send home annually a letter to parents and guardians that explains the importance of secure gun storage and their legal obligation to protect minors from accessing irresponsibly stored guns. This will be included in annual registration materials at each of our school sites, and it will require a signature acknowledging awareness of secure gun storage. Our hope is that by doing this, it can prevent some incidences of gun violences, again, in our homes as well as our schools, and hopefully keep our children safe in our community from gun violence. So that's the small part that I've been able to play in this campaign for protecting children from gun violence. And I don't know if people have questions, but I wanted to keep it short and sweet. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Ruthina, you said that the conversations with parents were sometimes difficult. Were they ever hostile?
They could start off hostile because, again, they would think that I'm coming from a framework of questioning their right as an American to own a gun. And I would always clarify that that's not the question I'm asking. You have every right to own guns and exercise that right. My question is about the safety of our children. So it would take some time to de-escalate the conversation, but I can honestly say that even when conversations started off a little bit hostile, we ended in a good place and our kids were friends. And even oftentimes with some of those folks that I started off a little bit difficult with, they got to the point where they wanted to know too homes that their children were visiting and whether or not that gun owner was doing the right thing and storing their guns securely and safely. And matter of fact, my child was 10 and one of her good friends' dad was a hunter. So right in the living room was a huge gun case that did not have a lock on it. And so after the conversation with the mom and the dad, that was one of the most difficult conversations, but he thought more about it because his child started to have some mental health issues, and he changed the way he stored those guns. He moved that into a more secure location in their house, put a lock on it that only his wife and he knew how to get to, and he even moved his ammunition. I mean, it wasn't anything that took away from his right to own those rifles and guns to hunt, but it was mainly to protect his child in the home and by virtue other children visiting the home.
That is absolutely amazing. And that is the power of this Be Smart message. Absolutely. That is truly amazing and life-saving efforts.
Well, I guess I have a question for Ruthina. When we've looked at the statistics, and this group has patiently listened to a lot of statistics about gun violence, one thing that seems to recur over and over in so many different contexts is the disparate effect of gun violence on people of color. And I wonder if Ruthina has any thoughts on that. It ranges from the incidences of school shootings happening to fall disproportionately in majority-minority schools, or in domestic violence situations. What do you have any insights into that, Ruthina?
Not personally. I can just speak from some of the work that the Black Voices Project has been doing. And a lot of that stems from what they've been seeing is early interaction with gun violence for some of those offenders. That's why I mentioned that it sometimes can create a pathway right into criminal justice systems, because unfortunately, when they were a child, they may have witnessed a violent shooting or someone resolving a disagreement with the use of a weapon. And that's how they've unfortunately been raised to result to that type of solution, or they feel more empowered by having a weapon. So I know Black Voices, they're working with Johnson County to provide some education and some intervention early in homes that they know that could be an early offender or someone with more of a history with gun violence, to try and get in there and start that re-education of not only the adults in the home, but also the children.
Liz, I can share a little more information from a presentation that we had recently. You know, the disproportionate numbers is not because Black Americans are inherently more prone to violence than others. The causes of this disproportionate impact are multifold and specific to the history of this country. Our country's history of discriminatory policies have left Black and Latinx people in segregated communities with high rates of poverty, unemployment, and incarceration. And when concentrated, these factors are strong determinants of violent crime. So this helps us understand why young boys and men of color living in impoverished, racially homogenous neighborhoods within cities are the leading victims of gun homicides and assaults.
I also heard a presentation once that, you know, contrary to stereotypes, Black people are much less likely to own guns than white people. Mm. And I think, you know, that's so ironic. Although there has been an upsurge in sales of guns to Black people lately.
Yeah, and that's been recently reported that there has been more of a increase in sales to Black Americans, but that I think correlates to some of the things that we see happening throughout the country, and people wanting to protect not only their home, themselves, but also others in their community.
Mm-hmm.